Book 36 of 2020 was Natives by Akala. So I hadn't heard of Akala before until I think I'd perhaps seen like a YouTube video of him talking, because I'd seen his book advertised on Audible, but I didn't know whether it would be for me. But when I listened to him talking about racism in the UK, I thought that it would be a really good book for me to read, because I felt like I wasn't educated enough to make an opinion about what was being discussed, and so I wanted to educate myself in that and to listen to the experiences of Black people and people of colour, because without listening to those voices you don't really have an understanding of what's going on from their perspective. So this book's really good at inoculating you against the whitewashing of history, and British history and world history is always presented from the viewpoint of the dominant people, which in those countries is white people. And you know, even American and British history disagree on events. You know, every nation has its own biased opinion of history and presents it in a way that makes them look good. So this is really interesting to listen to, because Akala kind of goes into a lot of detail about things that you might not be aware of, or if you were aware of them, you've not heard them from the perspective which he's discussing. So it's very informative and very good to listen to. It's actually, I was just writing on my board to do this review, and I've realised that a lot of the things that I learn in this have been very useful to me when I've been thinking about other things. So I would definitely recommend to listen to it. What Akala does is he talks about his own experiences of racism in the UK in the 1980s onwards. So he talks about how he was first stopped and searched when he was 12 years old, and he says that this is a regular experience for him and for people within his community. And that kind of made me realise my white privilege, because I would view the police as people to protect you if there was criminal behaviour. I have never been stopped and searched by the police. I have never felt like when a police officer's been around that they're going to stop and search me. Like, that's never happened to me. And it's never happened to anybody that I know, you know, that have spoken about it. It's not something that's a regular occurrence that needs to be spoken about. And so I find it really worrying that that is the experience of people who are Black and of colour, because there's just something unsettling about that. It feels very much like a totalitarian state to be treated like that. It reminds me of like Handmaid's Tale and all that kind of stuff. Akala also talks about his experience in education and how he suffered teachers who were behaving in ways that suggested that they were racist. And he kind of explains how if you've got a teacher and you're a child, and that person is obviously in the position of authority, their viewpoint of you as a child is going to seriously have a detrimental impact on you. It's going to make you disengage. It's going to make you underachieve because you're thought less of because of the colour of your skin. And I felt really sad listening to that, because I've always thought of racism as being more of a problem in the US than it is in the UK. My experience in the UK is that we're a little bit more tolerant, but listening to these experiences, it made me really sad that this is something that people who are Black and of colour have to deal with on a regular basis. Like, this is something that they have to suffer with. And I mean, there's things as well, like I have a friend who recently got called a name that was related to their ethnicity, and I was like, as if this is still happening, like as if people are still doing this today and don't see anything wrong with it. It's odd to me, because I would never do that to another person. I would never judge them on what they look like that. So it was interesting to learn about Akala's experiences and the experiences of people in his community, and the way that he kind of intertwines it with historical facts clearly demonstrates that there is systemic racism in the British Constitution. Like there is institutional racism within the police. He gives lots of different examples of things that I wasn't aware of, because I was born in the late 80s, so I was only a child. And I think in the education system, you don't get taught this stuff, so you have to search for it for yourself. So this was a really good book to fill in those gaps that obviously I wasn't aware of, and it's not something as well that anyone's ever spoken to me about. So for example, there was a New Cross house fire where this house burnt down and a lot of people died. They were having a birthday party and a lot of them, I think all of them died. It's a while ago since I read the book, but they were almost being accused of setting it on fire rather than actually being victims of the fire. And there was the Brixton riots in response to police not treating black people and people of colour with the respect that they deserve, like, you know, everybody would expect to be treated. There's also examples of, so there's a guy called Dalian Atkinson who was a retired footballer who got tasered to death in his house by the police. And you just think, like, you know, if you were to think of a footballer, a white footballer, imagine the police going into the house and tasering them to death. There'd be an absolute uproar. But a black footballer, it just doesn't sit right with me. It makes me feel a little bit sick that this is that the experience of somebody who's white and the experience of someone who's black is just so different. Because as a white person, I wasn't aware of this, and I'm like, how did I not know this? Like, how is this not, you know, how did I not know this? You know, I'm vaguely intelligent and I was not aware of this. I was just not. And I kind of am like, what is it about our society that means that this isn't known, that people don't know this, that people deny this? Why is that the case? Because there's something that doesn't sit right there, because, you know, you can't expect people of colour to be the ones to bring it up and talk about it, because they're already, you know, not feeling great about the fact that they get discriminated against on a regular basis. But I guess if it's not spoke, like what's the solution to this? There needs to be more open conversations about things like this, I think, and it needs to be taught in school. It needs to be in the education system. Like, this needs to be addressed when people are young, so that when they get older they have this awareness, and it's not just, you know, a month that they do Black History. Like, it should be intertwined into the whole curriculum. Like, this needs a whole kind of institutional restructuring to get rid of this as a problem. Akala also talks about legislation and about the SUS laws and about immigration acts and how they have disproportionately affected people of colour, and how that as a institutional issue is the reason why it's had that detrimental impact. So he gives that kind of background to explain why it's systemic, why, you know, when we think of racism, we think of someone calling somebody a name directly to the face, you know, an open act of racism. Sometimes it's not obvious. It's underneath. It's an undercurrent. It's the things that you say without realising, or, you know, you don't understand how society is structured in a way that disadvantages people who are Black and of colour. You know, you can't deny these things. Like, these things exist, like, they're there. You know, I've done a video on a book review on White Like Me by a guy who was talking about racism in America, and the amount of racist comments that I've had on that video, because people they just deny that there's racism. Like, they deny that this is a problem. And I don't know how you can do that when you hear people telling you what it feels like to be discriminated against because of their race. I don't know how you can deny that. I watched a video recently, and it was celebrities talking about their experiences of racism, and, you know, really famous people, like one that I'm thinking of is that affected me a lot was Rochelle from the Saturdays, and she was saying that when she was 7, they were having a party with her friends at school. One of her friends at school was having a birthday party, and she wasn't invited because she was a person of colour. And she doesn't remember this, but her parents told her about this that had happened. She was in the bath and she was trying to scrub her skin off because she didn't want to be the colour that she was. And I thought that's really, really sad. A 7-year-old child feeling like their skin is not acceptable to an adult. It's disgusting. I can't believe that this is a thing that people do to other people. Akala also talks about the Windrush generation, and we've all heard about this in the news. There's a massive scandal about the Windrush generation, and it's immoral to repatriate these people because they were recruited to England after the war to work in Britain because they've come from the colonies. Britain invaded where they'd originally, where they'd originally their lineage was from, and they saw themselves as British because in colonial Britain they were British. They identified with Britain. They saw the Queen as their queen, and so they view themselves as a British national because of the way that the colonies were structured. I mean, you only have to watch the Crown documentary to gather that about it. And they did us a favour because they left their home, to help us out and get jobs in Britain to help us, and obviously as well to help better themselves. Obviously each individual had their own reasons for coming to Britain, and they worked really hard and they contributed to the system, and now they're no longer welcome. Like, how can you do that to somebody when they've made their life here? Like, there's people who are children of the Windrush generation who've never been to these other countries where the parents were originally from, and they're being sent back to them where they've got nobody. It would be like somebody saying to me, right, you're gonna go back to Ireland because that's where my grandparents on my mum's side are from. I have nobody in Ireland. I don't know, well, I know a couple of people, but that's through other means, but they're not going to take me in and help me live. And like, it's just a bit crazy when you think about it like that. Like, why you're uprooting somebody and putting them in a country that they've never been to, or that maybe they've been to visit relatives infrequently, like once a year or something. It's very immoral to do that to people. And it's all kind of, there's things like not having documentation and stuff like that. And it's really difficult to get it. I watched a bit of a documentary video about it after I'd read this book, and just people talking about it. It's just, it's horrific because, excuse me, they're worrying that they're just going to get deported. Like, every day they're like, is this the day that I'm going to have to be, taken away, split up from family? I mean, there was one instance where one of the children were going to be deported, but the other child was fine because there was documentation for one child but not for the other, because of the way that the government had changed things, to systemically affect them. So, absolutely awful. Akala also mocks xenophobia of nationalists because, and this is funny because people that don't know history don't realise that the viewpoints that they've got are ridiculous. And if you think about British history, and obviously not many people know about British history clearly given the views that they've got, but Britain was invaded many times by different groups of people. So, the Romans and Anglo-Saxons, and because of the influence of Rome and the influence of, how we were originally in clans and things like that, we've got an amalgamation of language, we've got an amalgamation of culture, an amalgamation of religion. And so you can't really say that Britain is its own distinct kind of culture. And I mean, obviously we've got a culture, but it's based on a mixture of lots of other cultures. So you can't really discriminate against other people in other nations because we've got a lot of stuff that we've borrowed from them in our culture. So it just seems a little bit odd to do it. Like, it doesn't make logical sense to have those viewpoints and to be nationalist, because there's lots of movement around the world across history that has meant that we're all an amalgamation of each other. They've done DNA tests where they check your ancestry and your genes, and loads of people are from all over the shore. And it's like, how can you be a nationalist when you've got scientific data like that at your fingertips? Like, it boggles my mind that this is a viewpoint that people have. And I think, they mustn't know about history, because if they did, that wouldn't be what they think, would it? I mean, it's just odd, isn't it? People are very strange, I think, People have very odd opinions, and they're often uninformed, unfortunately. Akala also talks about the corruptness of government, which, governments are always corrupt, aren't they? And talks about kind of capitalism, and talks about how in the past governments have actively supported apartheid in South Africa. Even kind of universities and things in America did this, because this was in the White Like Me book that I reviewed as well, which is very, very interesting, because you've got governments saying that they're not racist, but yet then they're supporting apartheid in other countries. But obviously they're doing it for financial gain, so you could question that, I suppose, on the other viewpoint. But still, you for money reasons, you are perpetuating racism, essentially. He also talks about Winston Churchill. Everyone seems to have a very positive view of Winston Churchill, apart from somebody that I worked with who's a history teacher. So, obviously because he knows the history. But Winston Churchill, obviously, amazing in terms of helping to win the war and to be that kind of figurehead to make everybody band together and everything else. Was great in that sense. I've watched the documentary The Crown that I mentioned before, not documentary, we're talking about the TV drama of The Crown, which is probably not completely accurate, but he's represented well in that as well. But Churchill wasn't completely perfect. Like, he had his problems. Like, there was a lot of things about him that wasn't nice, and people were saying about so the Winston Churchill statue, Boris Johnson was like, why are they pulling down Winston Churchill's statue? Well, because he made a lot of racist comments. He said something like, so I'm paraphrasing, that he favoured using poison gas against beastly Indians. I mean, how disgusting. Like, this is somebody who is a politician, is in government, and I can completely see why Boris Johnson thinks he's amazing if he's made comments such as those, because he's just tried to replicate him, really, hasn't he, in that sense. Akala also claims that this codification of race is kind of like a tact of British intellectuals to advance white supremacy and power. Now, that's quite a loaded statement. I'm sure there's lots of people that might criticise that, but based on his discussion, it's got some weight. He also points out as well, which is something that stayed with me after I read this, that government suggests that they're humanitarians. Okay. Now, in history, they were humanitarians when they were scrambling for Africa. So, they were trying to domesticate and civilise the savages, and basically colonise places and dominate them and create the othering of other people. Now, that's not humanitarian to do that. To kind of enforce your ethic onto somebody else is very ethnocentric. It's very biased in the way that you view your culture as being more important than somebody else's, and that you think that you are higher than another culture. We see this a lot in the West. The West think they're a lot better than the East because of the way that they think about things. And I read a book about how the world thinks, and it was dichotomizing the West and Eastern thinking. Very interesting book, and it reminds me a lot of that because of this ethnocentric viewpoint. Cultures are different. They're not necessarily, each have got good and bad things about them. And if you're inside a culture, it's very difficult to see that other culture in the way that they see themselves. So this humanitarian scramble for Africa was obviously not humanitarian at all. It was for political power and for money. So we can expect that the government is not completely truthful in what they're saying. They use that humanitarianism as a way to excuse the behaviour so that people will buy into it and kind of go along with it. And you see this in modern day times as well. So this is what's really good about this book. Akala provides the history and then almost kind of like reflects it and parallels it with what's still happening right now. Because you think, oh yeah, this is history. What are you still talking about history for? Which is what people argue. That's not my thinking. I'm just mirroring what some people say. But Akala brings it into stark contrast because he's like, yeah, it's still going on, like this is still happening, which human nature. You would expect it to still be going on, particularly in, you know, government structures and things like that. So an example would be our government sells arms to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia are in war with Yemen, and we're talking about saving people in Yemen and being humanitarian to Yemen. In fact, we're not actually, are we? We're kind of like almost like trying to be humanitarians against Syria. But there's been airstrikes and things on Syria, and it's kind of like, you know, we're saying we're humanitarians and we're trying to save people, but yet we're bombing these places, or we're selling arms to places that are bombing these places. And it's like, how is this like going on? Akala also talks about the history of forcing opium on the Chinese and the season of the dock in Hong Kong. Essentially, governments will do whatever they please to advance their political aims. Whatever they want to do, they will do. Whoever's in power, whoever's got the money, they will do it. They don't really care about people. They care about this capitalist making money. And this is why capitalism is very unethical, because of the choices that you have to make in order to get money and power. They're often not in the benefit of people. So he's talking a lot about that. He also makes reference as a contrast to the capitalism. A lot of capitalist governments, particularly America, there's been so many comments that I've got on videos from people in America who are so against communism, and I'm not purporting that it's a good system and that I support it or anything like that, but they're so brainwashed by the fact that you know, communism is such a bad thing because of what happened in the Cold War and Soviet Russia and all the rest of it. You know, I completely understand it, but you know, rise above the propaganda that has been perpetuated in your own country. Like, think about it, you know, objectively, read about it from the Soviet perspective, like, you know, balance the kind of information, not necessarily that you'd get, you know, great Soviet perspective because of the way it's controlled and things, but, you know, there are defectors that you can, you know, read information from, like, you know, educate yourself in these things. Don't just accept things that are presented to you and think that that is the way that things are. So Akala was talking about how in Cuba, obviously, you know, I've actually, after reading this, looked into Cuba and looked into Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, because I was interested in those t-shirts that people wear, because he's like the face of revolutionary ideas, and a lot of young people wear them, particularly if they support socialism. But he wasn't a nice guy, really. Like, he killed a lot of people, and, you know, the argument is he killed people that were just as bad as him, because obviously Fidel Castro was a dictator who overthrew another dictator, so, you know, usurped another dictator. So, you know, they're as bad as each other, aren't they? But, you know, he's not this, you know, he might be a revolutionary, but there's a lot of things about him that are not great. And so I would never wear one of those t-shirts, because that doesn't sit right with me. If you're a humanitarian, you shouldn't be wearing one of those t-shirts. That's essentially what I'm trying to say. And having said that, what Akala says is that after that whole kind of restructuring of Cuba happened, and they defended themselves against America, who actually were exploiting Cuba, and so rightly so, they should have defended themselves in a similar way to how Haiti's, you know, defended themselves from the slave trade and things, which I don't know if that was in this book or it was in a different book. It might have been in this book as well, actually, but I didn't write that in my review. But afterwards, Cuba is a lot better in terms of education, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of providing humanitarian aid to other places in the world. And also they've got this thing where there's a medical scholarship, and people who go and study in Cuba can get it for free as long as they go back to their original country that they're from, and they provide medical care for the people in that country, which I think is a fabulous idea. You know, more places should do that. You know, why are we not doing that? Akala also talks about how Jamaica, Costa Rica and Ghana have more freedom of press than the UK do. The UK is only 35th in the World Press Freedom Index, which should give you an indication of how controlled our press is. Everything you read in the press, everything you read in a newspaper or you read online, it's been manipulated. It's been, you know, constructed so that it achieves an aim, and it's often a political aim. A lot of the people that own the newspapers are conservative. They spout this propaganda all the time, and so many people are you know, they just accept what's there. They don't like critically analyse it and kind of think about it and, you know, find other sources of information. I remember I was having a political discussion with somebody on my Facebook, and whenever I'm having a discussion with somebody and we're not kind of agreeing with things, I'm very interested to know why that person has that belief, because if someone's got a different belief to me, they might be right, and I would love to know what they've based that belief on. So I like to get underneath and I like to find out what are the foundations of that belief, why have they got that belief, what information have they seen that's made them have that belief, because if I see that information I might share that belief. So whenever I'm discussing with somebody, I'm always trying to get to the bottom of what their beliefs are. Now, people don't like it when I do this because I think they feel attacked, like I'm trying to prove them wrong, but I'm not. I'm doing it for my purposes because I want to know, am I wrong? Can you actually teach me something? And whenever I do this to anybody who's got a very strong view about something, they could never provide me with information that is rock solid. Like the person that I was having the discussion with on Facebook was giving me links to newspaper articles, and they were all the Daily Mail and the Guardian and all right-wing newspapers. And I was just like, do I have to spell this out to you? Do I have to explain this to you, that the information that you are reading has been manipulated? You are viewing it without understanding that they are giving you the viewpoints that they want you to have. How do I need to explain this to you? Like, this is obvious, but yeah, it still happens. And I find it so bizarre that people still read newspapers, that people still get their information from newspapers. I mean, obviously it's good to get information about the world, but you've got to understand that it's been chosen. Like, I mean, even things like world news that gets reported, there's plenty of things going on in the world that doesn't get reported because it's not deemed to be as important to that country, or it's not as inflammatory as they want it to be, or whatever it is. You know, if you think about terror attacks, for example, if there's any terror attacks in Europe, like Paris, for example, it's big news, it's everywhere. But there's terrorist attacks all the time in Eastern countries, like Turkey and, you know, places like that. There's like car bombs going off all the time and people dying and everything, but yet it's not reported because the media want you to think that the East is the enemy. And so it kind of creates that nationalism that they want, that kind of, you know, uniting against everybody else, that hatred, that kind of differentiation between groups and people like this. You know, this is why identity politics is a really bad thing for our country, because it's splitting everybody up so that no one finds any common ground, no one finds anything that's the same about each other. We can't unite against the structure. Like, the power structure wants you to be disenfranchised, wants you to be split up, wants you to not band together, because if we banded together, there'd be a revolution, and they don't want that. So this is why they're trying to, you know, split everybody up all the time. So anyway, I've got on a rant about politics and viewpoints and whatever else, as I always do. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this book because it gives you a UK perspective rather than a American perspective, which a lot of books that I've come across tend to do. And so it makes you realise as a British citizen that it's not as tolerant as what it appears to be from a white person's perspective. I didn't know this. I thought we were all adults and we could accept each other and whatever else. You know, I've had friends that are black and of colour and they've never spoken to me about this. And I imagine it's because they think that I wouldn't be understanding or that I wouldn't get it, which is sad. That makes me feel really sad about that, because I can't help Merton be an ally because that's never been discussed between us. I mean, maybe I should have brought it up. I don't really know what the answer is to that question. What I would say about this book is that it is very memoir. It's very focused on Akala's life, and I would have preferred more of a focus on history and politics and critical analysis, because the thing about history for me is that I can get a little bit bored sometimes listening to history, but Akala does it in such a way that's so engaging. Like, you want to know about it, you want to kind of find out about it. So I would definitely recommend it, but bear in mind you're going to hear a lot about his life. And I think as well, I don't know if it's something that is an insecurity of his because of his experiences, but he tries to kind of reaffirm things about himself being successful, and about him driving a fancy car and him living in a fancy house. And it felt a little bit like, you know, when someone's trying to look better than they are, but I recognise that it might just be him trying to re-emphasise that the viewpoints that people are having of black people and people of colour, like the police, for example, are not founded, because there are people that are black and of colour that are successful, obviously, and so they shouldn't be treated any differently to white people. So overall, very, very good to listen to. I mean, I don't know what it would be like to read it, because I always have a different experience of reading and listening to, but fantastic to listen to. He's got such a good voice for, like, talking about history. I would be very interested in him presenting another book about history and things like that was more an analysis rather than a memoir. So yeah, I would definitely recommend it.